At 62, I was content with where my life had landed. I had recently retired from teaching and was living quietly in a small house on the edge of town. Most of my days were filled with gardening and reading, and while I miss my husband, who had passed 5 years ago, I had settled into a routine that worked for me. I was okay with the peace and solitude. But everything changed when my stepson, Alex, came to live with me. Alex is 22. He just graduated from college and had dreams of becoming a graphic designer. His dad and I had married 2 years before he passed away, so Alex and I didn't have much time to bond, but we were always friendly enough. When he called me a few months ago, I hadn't heard from him in a while. "Hey, it's Alex," he said, his voice a little hesitant. "I know this is kind of sudden, but I need to ask you a favor." I could hear the concern in his voice, and even before he finished, I knew what he was going to say. He was in between jobs, struggling to make rent, and needed a place to stay while he got his career off the ground. I told him he could stay as long as he needed, just until he found something stable. I remember the day he arrived. I spent the morning tidying up the guest room, making sure everything was just right. The hours leading up to his arrival, though, felt strange. I was nervous. It had been so long since I'd had anyone living in my space. And to be honest, I was nervous about living with a man so much younger than me. When he finally pulled up in his beat-up old car, I went outside to greet him. He flashed that same grin I remembered from family events, but there was something different about him. He wasn't the awkward teenager I had known. Alex had grown into a tall, broad-shouldered young man with a confident air about him. "Hey, Mara," he said, giving me a quick hug. "Thanks for letting me stay here." "Of course," I replied, trying to sound casual, though I felt a little out of place. "I hope the drive wasn't too bad." "Nah, it was fine. The first few days were uneventful. Alex mostly stayed in his room or was out looking for jobs. I tried to stay out of his way, not wanting to be the overbearing stepmom. But the house felt different with him in it. I noticed small things, like the way he'd smile at me from across the table, or how he'd linger in the kitchen just a little longer than necessary, chatting about his day. It was nice to have someone around again, even if I didn't expect it. Then, about 2 weeks after he moved in, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. One night, I had gone to bed early, the house quiet, as it always was. It was probably close to midnight when I heard the soft creak of my bedroom door opening. Groggily, I turned over and saw Alex standing in the doorway. "Alex?" I mumbled, half asleep. "Is everything okay?" He stepped into the room, his figure silhouetted by the light from the hallway. His face was hard to read in the shadows, but I could tell something was on his mind. "I couldn't sleep," he said, quietly walking toward my bed. "Mind if I sit?" I sat up, rubbing my eyes. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated for a moment before sitting down at the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice almost whispering. "I've just been feeling a little lost." I didn't expect him to say that. I had always seen Alex as a self-assured guy, confident and capable. But in that moment, sitting there beside me, he seemed so vulnerable. Without really thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the right thing to do. "You'll be fine," I said softly. "Everyone goes through rough patches. It's just a phase, I promise." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a brief moment, the air between us felt different, thicker, almost. I didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't pull away. I just stayed there, my hand still on his arm. "Thanks, Mara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. He stood up slowly, his eyes lingering on me for a second longer before he turned and walked back to his room. The door clicked shut behind him, and I lay back down, my heart pounding. What had just happened? I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if something had changed between us in that moment. The next morning, it was as if nothing had happened. Alex came downstairs for breakfast, talking about his job hunt and some YouTube video he'd watched late last night. He was acting totally normal, and I tried to convince myself that I was just overthinking everything. I figured I was probably reading too much into it. Maybe it was just because I hadn't shared my space with anyone in so long. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it, that moment in my room lingered in my mind. As the days went on, I started noticing things that I hadn't before. Little things, like the way his hand would brush mine when we passed in the hallway, or how he seemed to watch me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't overt, nothing anyone else would have picked up on, but it was enough to make me second-guess every interaction. And the strangest part, I didn't mind. I'd been so used to feeling invisible since my husband passed, and now I wasn't sure what I was feeling. One evening, a few weeks later, we were both in the kitchen. I was chopping vegetables for dinner, and Alex was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. "So," he said, setting his phone down, "I might have an interview next week. Nothing fancy, but it's a start." "That's great," I said, genuinely happy for him. "Where's it at?" He went on to explain the job, but honestly, I was only half listening. I was too focused on the way his eyes lit up when he talked, the way his voice carried this quiet confidence. It was a side of him I hadn't really noticed before. And then, out of nowhere, he reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair off my face. "You had something there," he said casually, but his voice was softer than usual. I froze. It was such a small thing, but it felt significant. For a second, I thought I might be imagining things again. But when I looked up at him, the way he was looking at me, there was no mistaking it. My heart was pounding so loud. I was sure he could hear it. I cleared my throat and stepped back, trying to act like nothing had happened. "Thanks," I mumbled, turning back to the cutting board. He didn't say anything else, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in the kitchen. The way he had looked at me, the way my stomach flipped when his fingers brushed against my skin. It wasn't just my imagination. Something had shifted between us, and I didn't know how to feel about it. A week later, Alex came home from his interview looking more excited than I'd seen him in weeks. "They liked me," he said, grinning as he dropped his bag by the door. "I'll know for sure in a few days, but they seemed really interested." "That's amazing," I said, smiling. I could tell how much it meant to him, and seeing him so happy made me feel happy too. "We should celebrate." That night we ordered takeout and opened a bottle of wine. We sat in the living room, talking and laughing like old friends. It felt so easy, so natural. And for a while, I forgot about all the weirdness between us. But as the night went on, and the wine started to loosen us up, the conversation took a turn I hadn't expected. "Do you remember that night?" Alex asked suddenly, his voice quiet. "When I came into your room?" I nearly dropped my glass. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just nodded. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about it," he admitted, looking down at his hands. "About you." I stared at him, my heart racing. "Alex, You don't have to say anything." He cut me off, his voice soft. "I know this is complicated, and I get it if you don't feel the same way." He hesitated, then looked up at me. "I care about you, Mara, more than I probably should." My stomach dropped. Hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. Part of me wanted to push him away, to tell him this was crazy, and that it could never happen. But another part of me, the part that had been lonely for so long, didn't want to let go of what I was feeling. "I care about you too," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The look in his eyes when I said that, it was like something clicked into place. He reached out and took my hand, his touch sending shivers up my arm. "I don't want to mess this up," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to take it one step at a time." I nodded, my mind still reeling. "Okay." In the days that followed, Things were different between us. We didn't talk about what had happened that night, but there was an unspoken understanding that something had changed. We were careful around each other, almost as if we were afraid of breaking whatever fragile connection we'd started building. But at the same time, there was this underlying tension, this pull that neither of us could ignore. One night, after Alex had officially gotten the job, we decided to celebrate again. We sat on the couch, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about his plans for the future. But as the evening wore on, the conversation drifted back to us. "I've been thinking about that night," he said, his voice low. "About us." "So have I," I admitted. He reached for my hand again, his thumb brushing softly against my skin. "I know this is complicated," he said, "but I don't care. I just want to be with you." My heart was pounding. Everything in my head was screaming at me to stop, to think about the consequences. But in that moment, all I could think about was him, about the way he made me feel, about the possibility of something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Happiness. "I want that too," I whispered. And just like that, the last bit of resistance I had crumbled. When he leaned in to kiss me, I didn't pull away. That night changed everything. Once we crossed that line, there was no going back, not that either of us wanted to. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the way everything else seemed to fall into place after that. I don't know how to explain it, but being with Alex felt right, even if it wasn't what I'd ever expected my life to look like. But that didn't mean it wasn't messy. The next morning, I woke up with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite sort through: guilt, excitement, fear, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. When I went downstairs, Alex was already in the kitchen making coffee. He looked up when I walked in, and for a second, I thought things might feel awkward between us. But then he smiled, that same easy, warm smile he'd always had, and suddenly it didn't feel so strange. "Morning," he said, handing me a cup. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound normal even though my heart was racing. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, leaning against the counter. I was thinking about last night. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. But before I could say anything, he added, "I don't regret it." Not for a second. His words caught me off guard, but they also made something inside me relax. "I don't either," I admitted softly. From that point on, we stopped pretending there wasn't something between us. But it wasn't like we were suddenly a couple or anything. We both knew how complicated the situation was, and we were careful not to push things too far too fast. We didn't want to ruin whatever fragile balance we'd found. Over the next few weeks, things between us fell into a strange but comfortable rhythm. During the day, Alex would be busy with work, either at the office or on his laptop in the dining room. I kept myself busy with my usual routine: gardening, errands, reading. But there was this unspoken understanding that we'd always end up spending the evenings together. Sometimes we'd talk for hours, sharing stories and laughing like old friends. Other times, we'd sit in comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's company. And then there were the nights when the tension between us would creep back in, making the air feel heavy in a way that neither of us quite knew how to handle. One night, about a month after everything started, we were sitting on the couch watching a movie. It was late, and the house was dark except for the glow of the TV. I wasn't even paying attention to the screen anymore. My mind was too busy spinning with everything that had happened, and everything that still felt unresolved. "You okay?" Alex asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I said quickly, though I knew I didn't sound convincing. "I'm just thinking about us," he asked gently. I nodded, not trusting myself to say it out loud. He shifted closer, his hand resting lightly on mine. "I know this isn't exactly normal," he said, "and I know it's not easy, but I meant what I said, Mara. I care about you, and I don't want to let that go." I looked at him, my heart aching with a mix of emotions I couldn't even name. "I care about you too, Alex," I said quietly. But it's not just complicated. It's risky. People wouldn't understand. I don't care what people think, he said firmly. I only care about what you think, about what you want. His words hung in the air between us, and for the first time, I let myself really think about what I wanted, about what would make me happy. And the truth was, I hadn't felt this alive in years, not since my husband died. Maybe not even before that. Alex had brought something back into my life that I hadn't even realized I was missing. I want to try, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't know where this will go, but I want to see. He smiled then, that warm, genuine smile that had always made me feel at ease. Me too, he said softly. The next few months were a whirlwind. We kept things quiet, careful not to let anyone know what was going on between us. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I questioned everything, moments when the weight of what we were doing felt overwhelming. But there were also moments of pure joy, moments when I felt like I was finally living again. Alex's job was going well, and he started talking about moving out, getting his own place in the city. The idea terrified me. I didn't want to lose what we had. But at the same time, I knew it was inevitable. He was young and he had his whole life ahead of him. And as much as I wanted to hold on to him, I also knew I couldn't keep him tied to me forever. When he finally found an apartment, I helped him pack up his things. It was bittersweet, watching him load his car with boxes and bags, knowing that our time together was coming to an end. But when he hugged me goodbye, he whispered something in my ear that made my heart ache in the best way. "This isn't the end," he said. "Not for us." And in that moment, I believed him. Sometimes life throws you curveballs you never see coming. Sometimes it's messy and complicated and doesn't make sense. But sometimes it leads you to something beautiful. And while I don't know what the future holds for me and Alex, I do know this. For the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid to find out. What do you think?